I'm feeling
welcome to those of you joining for the first time. A little background on the living room sessions. When COVID started and our summits and conferences got canceled, we recognized that we were all missing each other and having a bit of that uncertainty. And so Christina and I wanted to make a space for people to come together to learn and build connections and keep these important conversations going. So it's been amazing to take our jewelry community online, and thank you all again for being here. Just a few reminders. This is a safe space to learn and connect. Please
it's okay to decide.
Respectful. Excuse me. Okay, one of these reminders is to please stay on mute whenever somebody else is speaking. What I was saying before is this is a safe space. Everyone should feel comfortable here. Please be respectful in the chat box and if you're privately messaging somebody. And if there is any activity going on that is inappropriate, please direct message me or privately message me and I'll take care of that. This session is being recorded and will be posted on our website, so please be mindful of that, especially if you're on video. And we are so excited to be doing this session in partnership with Ethical Metalsmiths, very appropriate for the ethics session. And so if you're not familiar with Ethical Metalsmiths, we'll put the website in our chat box here. And with this work, it takes a village. And so Ethical Metalsmiths is like your village for doing this work. So we have the president of Ethical Metalsmiths here, Monica Stevenson, and she's going to give a little bit more information about the organization.
So I'm on. Thank you so much, and I'm so excited to be here. This has been a bright spot, these living room sessions, since the beginning of COVID, having them kind of at intervals. There's been a little bit of a gap, but we're back in full force, and it's incredible to see everyone's faces. That's probably my favorite part of these things. It's not just a webinar of talking heads. I enjoy seeing everyone, and I'm very excited and honored that we have this intersection of Christina Miller, living room sessions, and Maggie, and the beginning of kind of Christina's journey, which was founding of Ethical Metalsmiths back in 2004. So I'm honored a little, it's a little daunting to sit across the table, so to speak, in this capacity, but it's an honor to kind of be the president since May of 2020. So this is a fairly recent assuming the mantle for me from Alexandra Hart, who's also here, wave Alexandra, who led us fearlessly for the previous 3 years. I joined Ethical Metalsmiths on my own journey towards responsibility when I was setting up my gem business back in about 4 or 5 years ago. And what I found was, I'm not a metalsmith, so I had to make sure that are these my people? But what I found was really a community of like-minded individuals who, from all facets of the industry, and all kind of with one sort of purpose in mind, which is how do we kind of continue this journey of responsibility? How do we start the journey? How do we begin? So I think with really EM is about community, and the idea that we are, I really like the idea that we kind of are about getting to your why. Why would we choose to do something more elaborate and complicated than just making and selling jewelry? Why do we need to understand the impact of our decisions on the rest of the supply chain? So hopefully with our members and our resources and our vast kind of institutional knowledge with all of those participants, you can maybe get to the how a little bit as well. We do hopefully provide some education, some resources to maybe continue your journey, but really if we can spark the why, I feel like we're kind of doing our job as an organization. To that end, we've had some really interesting, complicated conversations really taking place in the last few months that are bigger than just what's happening in our committees. It's become kind of at the core and like of who we are and what ethics actually is, which led us to engaging an ethicist and some incredible conversations. So I'm really happy that we can actually sort of open this up to everyone to kind of listen in and participate and kind of learn from what we have been doing as an organization in the last few months. I'm going to turn it back over to Christina so that she can introduce our guest. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Folks continue to join the call, and I think it's just lovely to acknowledge that we have 110 people on the line with us today, if not more, willing and interested in participating in this conversation. So it's very exciting. You know, Monica gave a great backdrop to why we're doing this today. Maggie, are you taking care of admitting people? I should ignore it. Okay, thanks. You know, oftentimes with ethics, we have a core about ourselves that allows us to navigate through the world in a way that we think is right. It's sort of our own agency that we take with decision making. But in a complex environment like the jewelry industry, sometimes those things are really hard to correlate between what you want to be, what your intention is, what your heart says, what you want to do, and verifying whether or not that's the reality of what you're supporting. And it's never even as clean as good, bad. It's always something in between. What's the best possible scenario given everything that's going on in the space, and how do we move towards something better? I also wanted to acknowledge that, you know, we have, you know, we're working diligently at increasing diversity in all of this programming, and we look for recommendations. We make efforts to bring a diverse group into the space, and we will keep doing that. You can tell from a quick scan, for those of you that are on video, that we need to do more. So I just wanted to acknowledge that as well. And, you know, it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Mark Wheeler. He is the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs at San Diego State University at Imperial Valley. He was a long time at the main San Diego campus and just recently took up a position at the Imperial Valley campus. He's a professor of philosophy and also runs the Institute for Ethics and Public Affairs at San Diego State University. I also know him personally, and for disclosure, he is married to Alexandra Hart, the executive director of Ethical Metalsmiths. So, you know, we resource our increased awareness according to our means. And in this case, we're so lucky to have someone as skilled and treasured as Mark is in his community as an activist. So I'm not going to read through your whole bio so that we can really get into this conversation. And so Mark, I'm going to hand it to you to sort of get us in the mindset. And then when we're ready, you can hand it back to me and I'll introduce our first question asker.
Thank you, Christina. And Christina and Maggie, thank you for creating these spaces. Very powerful and important opportunities. And my thanks to Ethical Metalsmiths and the hard work they're doing, creating a community of ethical and responsible members of the jewelry community and jewelry industry, a noble and difficult endeavor. So thank you for doing that work, and good morning or good afternoon as the case may be, or good evening as the case may be, wherever you are in the world. It's nice to see you all. I see many, many faces and many, many names. And I'm grateful to see so many of you interested in these questions. And before we get to the questions, before we raise them and take them on, let's first together as a concerned community pause and take a couple of deep breaths. Breathe. Reflect on your consciousness, your awareness of your awareness, and your awareness of what else you're aware of in your awareness. Consciousness is the ground of ethics. It's the ground for everything we'll be talking about today. We have to be quiet and aware of ourselves, what is and what is possible. This is the fundamental moment. If we're not aware of the truth, if we're not aware of what is, and if we're not aware of what is possible, then the question of what to do, what we should do, can't arise. Of course, ethics is concerned with what we ought to do, how to do the right thing. Now let's take this moment and turn it toward what I take to be and what others take to be the fundamental ethical question that we each must keep in mind at all times. One way to put the question in English is, what do I love? Whom do I love? Another way to put it is, what do I care most about? Another way to put it is, what is most important to me? Not an easy question to answer, but a question that must be raised and must be answered because it creates the final ends, as they get called, the guiding lights we use to orient our action. And now again, breathe, and it's in this moment where we're in a position to make a choice, when we are free to decide, that we take charge of or have access to our most remarkable power, which is the power to choose on the basis of what we love. That, in essence, is the shape of an ethical life. Making choices based on what you love or what you consider to be most important, what you care most about, freely, with as much awareness as is available to you. This is the root of every ethical question. And now, before we get into some of the questions that will animate the discussion, here are the two lead questions that, as people concerned about being ethical in relation to jewelry and the jewelry industry, I would ask you to have in mind. What do I love most about jewelry and the jewelry industry? What's important about jewelry? What's most important about jewelry? What's most important about the jewelry industry for you? What's most important about metalsmithing, or whatever it is that you think about when you think about being ethical in relation to your work with jewels and metals? That's the first question. And second, given an answer to that question, right, what can I choose to do differently now, today, in my life, to make jewelry or the jewelry industry better, given what I love about it, given what I think is most important about it? Let's try and keep our poise, our comportment with respect to this remarkable capacity to remain aware of what is and what is possible for us. And I'll turn it back to Christina, I think, who will introduce Jared. And again, my gratitude to you. It's great to be with you here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thanks so much, Mark. We're getting a few questions about whether or not we're recording this. Yes, we are. Because you're registered, you will get the follow-up email, which will have the link to the recording as well as some key takeaways. That's one of the things that we process for this, so thank you. So introducing Jared Holstein is a great pleasure for me. He's a dear friend, so that's important to reveal in our transparency moments. Jared also sells gemstones and diamonds. He became known to many of us through Perpetuum Jewels and is now on his own with Damadeo. So he's a buyer of rough and cut stones, and he wholesales these, again, as the business name Damadeo, and really focuses on post-consumer, antique and gemstones of a known source, so where you can identify where they're coming from. He also has a role in Ethical Metalsmiths, serves on the Responsible Sourcing Committee, is active in the Jewelry Industry Summit, as well as has been sort of critical to the work of the Jewelry Glossary Project. These are all links that we can drop into the chat for those of you that might be hearing those terms for the first time. So, and his role in getting us started, you know, we all have had lots and lots of conversations about these topics, right? But I would say, Jared, if I may, that you've been pained by some of these topics, like they keep you up at night. And so I want you all to just be open. Jared has a question, but he also has sort of a framing concept to share with you all. And it'll take about, 6 minutes to kind of get through his presentation. But I think it will help open the door around the, kind of the responsible sourcing piece is one of the key ethical questions that we wrangle with. And Jared has an interesting way of understanding it. So go for it. Thank you and welcome.
Oh, geez. Well, I just want to thank Christina and Maggie, as always, for setting up these really wonderful and I think crucial and feel healing to me. These webinars are just spectacular. And thank you, Mark, for allowing me to ask questions of you, which I have a feeling I'll be doing for many years to come. So my fundamental question is, and I just want to acknowledge and step back and say that there's probably people on this call who have all levels of knowledge about the jewelry industry and the supply chain and how it works. So I hope that everything I'm about to say is understandable and relatable. But my fundamental question is, how can we create trust among members of the jewelry material supply chain that we can trust? As a background, which is extensive, but I hope helpful, the jewelry industry or global jewelry community has an information problem, which is that there's not very much of it, and the quality of that information isn't necessarily high. So regardless of where in the supply chain we sit, and here in the US, that usually means in the middle or at the end of it, we are therefore nearly always working with stories, usually partial stories, when trying to understand the realities surrounding materials like precious metals, diamonds, and colored gemstones, and their extraction, processing, and travels. Those things which combine to create their provenance and their origin stories. So we must trust that the information that we are receiving, nearly all of which are claims, is true. For example, if a company or a dealer says, this is an unheated, ethically mined, conflict-free, fair trade Ceylon sapphire cut in Sri Lanka, The only piece that is objective and testable is that the material is corundum. All the other descriptors are claims. We as a community are forced to trust in the words and narratives of corporations and people, many of whom we have never and will never meet, all over the world, and dictated sometimes years or decades ago as a stand-in for quality supporting data, evidence, and information. The opacity in our supply chain sometimes serves to protect source communities, but historically has protected profit over people and planet. The quality of information is degraded by inadvertent breakdowns in the transmission of information via a lack of shared definitions of words and terms, different cultural understandings, different practices, and the like. And I just want to give a plug here for the Jewelry Glossary Project, where we are working diligently to create shared definitions of these key terms. You can go to jewelryglossaryproject.com. And this is separate from partial truths, creative marketing narratives, which are technically accurate, but deceptive, and then on, of course, to outright lies. The realities associated with the materials, from amazing to bad, and to note that most materials are a blend of both positive and negative impacts environmentally and socially. These realities are not even necessarily highly correlated with the intentions of fellow industry folk, which range from the best of intentions to amoral to dictated by survival instincts or lack of agency and thus more excusable, to immoral and inexcusable. All claims about materials, regardless of whether they come from artisanal sources, medium-scale mines, large-scale mines, third-party certified or verified sources, etc., ultimately come down to trust. Some have sought technical solutions like blockchain to provide a greater degree of confidence in the reliability of information, to reduce opacity and to increase transparency. But all the third-party verifications and audits, blockchain blah-blahs, and assurance systems are cheatable. The reason this matters, to put it simply, is that there's a lot of bullshit and objective untruths attached to materials in the jewelry realm. And this matters when these untruths obscure human or environmental harm, or are selling a positive benefit, like environmental sustainability or community beneficiation, which does not exist. The realities are complex, and complexities are often harder to sell to consumers. But I know that myself and many on this call want to empower our customers with accurate, agnostic information to let them make their own informed judgments. And fundamentally, there are plenty of us who want to handle materials that produce the greatest amount of good for everyone in the supply chain, particularly those in source communities where that benefit is most often needed. We've inherited a system of mineral exploitation and trade that was born of colonialism, and it is our responsibility as people with agency to create better realities for those with less agency and center their needs and their desires as they identify them. So I ask, Mark, are there more human approaches like ethics or morality-based frameworks, mechanisms, or practices that are better able to breach economic, language, and cultural barriers that we as a global jewelry community can employ to create more reliable trust relationships and networks? How can we have a greater degree of confidence that the claims we are hearing or making hew as close as possible to shared truths? Thank you.
Thank you, Jared, for raising so many questions, which emerge out of your lead question. So let me just make sure I restate the lead question. How do we create trust among members of the jewelry members' supply chain? And as with many ethical questions, we need to unpack the question, and you, Jared, help us do that a little bit. So thank you for that. The fundamental ethical question here is a question about trust. And so the general philosophical problem here is well recognized and very difficult. How do we create trust among ourselves, among members of a community, whatever community we're talking about? A legendary and difficult question, right? Prior question, and here Socrates raises his snub-nosed head and reminds us we have to know what we're talking about when we're talking about trust in order to try to create it among ourselves. Let me leave aside for the moment the question of defining trust and simply note that it is tied to the concept of beneficence or love, insofar as trust presupposes that the other in whom you are placing trust is acting on your behalf or in your interests, for your sake, for your behalf, and not for their own purposes, using you as a means, as a tool, as part of the technology or mechanism by means of which they get what they want, right? So trust is intrinsically connected to an ethical attitude, an attitude of care or love or beneficence. Another question that emerges, how do we create trust among members of the community who are relying upon the jewelry materials supply chain? How do we ensure that the information we are using to make good decisions, given that we care, is accurate? This is a very different kind of question. It's a question about truth. And the question, what is truth, has challenged us generation after generation, right? In both philosophical and religious spheres in the West, it's been a central question. How do we ensure truth? We, as a matter of fact, cannot live in a post-truth environment. To say that we're living in a post-truth environment is to reveal the false face of that statement. So how do we ensure truth? What is truth? Well, in the West at least, and this is common across many wisdom traditions, truth is grasping what is as it is. Sometimes this gets characterized in terms of accurately measuring what is. But the more primordial or existential moment of truth is being aware of what reveals itself to you. And so right now you're aware of my voice and what my language reveals. If you're looking at me, you're aware of my face and what it reveals to you. And therein is your truth in this moment about me here now. And what is measurable? Well, on the one hand, we can work towards agreed upon measures like rulers or thermometers. Agreed upon measures that we can all use to decide whether a particular claim is accurate about the temperature or the length of something. And of course, there is the question of trust. Is someone using a ruler that's been shortened a bit? Are they tipping the scales, right? So even in the context of established metrical systems, the need for trust remains. But I hate to break it to everybody if it's not already on the front page of your newspaper, but it's extraordinarily difficult to measure things accurately. Not only is it difficult to come up with an agreed upon measure, but even if you have an agreed upon measure, it's extraordinarily difficult to measure effectively and accurately. Just imagine how difficult it must be for all of the hardworking medical professionals and medical researchers trying to measure COVID-19 to get an accurate understanding, an accurate model of this wee little thing that's causing so much trouble, right? And yet we are not thereby rendered impotent. Right? We can work very hard to develop these kinds of objective measures, these agreed upon measures. But the precondition for those kinds of bases for truth is our capacity together in dialogue to trust each other as witnesses of our truths. You have, I have, we all have been cultured, and we all have the inheritance of thousands, if not millions of years of evolutionary shaping of our organism and our consciousness, which has brought us today to this session where you can understand pretty much everything I'm saying, and you can discern visually and orally and in other ways the environment in which you find yourself. And you can describe it. You can tell me your story. And if I trust you and you're telling me the truth and you're being sincere, and I understand that you're not just telling me a fictional fable, thereby I gain access to the truth as you understand it, right? And that will never go away. Our reliance on each other reporting in a sincere fashion to the best of our abilities, the truth as it reveals itself to us about the metal we're digging up in the ground, about the way that we've treated our laborers, about the way that I've priced this item. All of these decisions are personal and rely upon a particular person's experience of the situation. That never goes away. When we develop measurement instruments, complex measurement instruments, all of that work depends upon individual scientists with their personal experiences and their understandings working together to develop them and agree upon them. Let me shift away from the question of truth for a second to the question of how we can be more human in our approaches to these questions, like the question about the materials supply chain. And what I love about Jared's sincerity and his insight is that in posing the question that way, he's in effect helped us to see how to answer it. So what is it to be human? We're so used to being biologized that we tend to think of ourselves as animals, and we tend to sometimes discount the ways in which historically being human was understood. I'm not disputing the claim that we're animals. What I'm going to introduce is a way of thinking about being human which transcends the biological and is expanding ever more widely in philosophical circles to include more of the organisms in the world than just the human organisms. So what is it to be human, as we've received that concept, that way of measuring ourselves in the West? It's to be a free, conscious, moral agent. I have the sense from my interactions with certain non-human animals that they are more human than many of the human animals I've encountered. If I hold the human I'm talking about and the elephant I'm talking about to the agreed upon measure of what it is to be human in terms of being a free, conscious, moral agent. And so the personal yields the interpersonal, which gives us the hope or the opportunity to develop the objective. But the objective is always grounded in the intersubjective, which is always grounded in the subjective. We always come back to ourselves. And so, Jared, I think the question of how to approach these questions in a more human way, from my point of view, is to raise the question, how can we be more caring? How can we be more respectful? How can we create trust, without which community is a facade, without which community is merely a word and not real, if what we use as our concept of community is robust, and since the beginnings of Western philosophy, the notion of community has been robust, involving trust, interdependence, a common effort to ensure the good for each and for all. That's what community was all about, and is all about in its noble forms still in the West. And I say the West because I must identify myself with my tradition. I honor the indigenous, and I want to make a moment here for an acknowledgement that I am currently in my office in San Diego State University, Imperial Valley in Calexico, in California, United States of America. I work and live on land which was cared for by the Kumeyaay and the Quechan, the Cahuilla, and other indigenous communities for tens of thousands of years before people like me showed up. And I'm grateful for their stewardship, and I'm grateful for their wisdom traditions. I've been fortunate to have been enfolded in some of the families and communities in the regional indigenous community. And I can say that their conception of how to relate to each other and to the world around them conforms to the frameworks in the West that I cherish the most, frameworks that are grounded in love and trust and truth and goodness and relationships and kindness. So the first answer I'll offer is a kind of hypothetical. If all of you here now are aware of each other and aware of each other's commitment to improving the trustworthiness of the jewelry metals supply chain. And if you recognize that this is something each and every one of you is interested in pursuing because you think it's important enough, then that is the first step towards creating trust in the jewelry community, in the jewelry industry. And then the next question is, are there other groups that are doing the same thing? Can we weld ourselves into a broader community of people freely committing themselves to improving the trustworthiness of the jewelry materials supply chain through the trust relationships you have with each other, and then identifying what I will call, in a loving way, the adversaries, those who challenge our commitment, who don't join us in holding up as valuable trustworthiness in the jewelry materials supply chain. These are our best teachers because they show us an alternative point of view, which we must take on and understand in order to appreciate, first of all, not in the sense of acknowledge as right or good, but appreciate in the sense of understand. And then, unless we've changed our minds, the work becomes, how can we work with our adversaries to ensure that in spite of their best efforts, to the contrary, we ensure the trustworthiness of the jewelry materials supply chain. The more it's ribosomal, it's grassroots, the more agents in the community who are working towards a trustworthy jewelry materials supply chain, the more trustworthy it will be. The more agents who are unaware of the need to build that community and to build that trustworthiness and to have that trust, the less trustworthy the jewelry materials supply chain will be. And it would be nice to think that you could set up a police force or you could set up a bunch of laws, but the laws are only as good as the people enforcing them. The police are only as capable as the people directing them, or they themselves directing themselves in moral ways, right? It ultimately turns on us, right? And I'll stop there. I'm unpacking the question and pointing to philosophical issues that are embedded in the question that if you help yourselves to answer them, you'll be able to answer many other questions than just this one, in addition to this one, from an informed ethical point of view. And I'll stop.
I'd like, Jared, if you'd like to just, if you have any kind of follow-up thoughts. We have a few other questions that we're prepared to work on a bit that came from the audience and the individuals are in attendance, but you might have a comment or a response for the group or for Mark. So go ahead, Jared, if you want to.
Thank you. I think I'll have to listen to that about 4 times, and I'll have 4 times as many more questions after that, or maybe 18 times as many more questions. But my question is, we quite often don't have the opportunity to, because 80% of colored stones, a large percentage of precious metals, 20% of diamonds, which we don't have access to anyway, are produced artisanally in parts of the world where we quite often will, it's very difficult to have a direct connection with those people. So given where we are with, you know, social media and connectivity, it's easy, like we're all here, we're on this call. It's easy to engage with this community and to create trust within this community. But are there frameworks that are there frameworks that we can apply in situations where we may only meet a person once? If you fly to another country and attend a trade show, so that you can say this is, so that you can best express those things which are most important to you, and in some way judge that the answers you're receiving are congruent with your like your fundamental guiding principles.
I can sketch an answer to that question. And I think the sketch will be useful even if not fully filled in. So let me first revert to the fundamental question that everyone needs to ask themselves in preparation for making a decision about whether or not they're going to buy rough from this person on this day with this kind of access to that person, right? You know, what is most important for me? What do I care about the most? And that's a very personal question. It's a very personal investigation. It's a very private and personal odyssey, which is, I hope, for each of you well informed by your conversations with the people who love you the most and the people who care about you the most, because they're the ones who can give you insight into yourself as you explore yourself and decide for yourself and take on the responsibility for yourself in answering those questions. Unavoidable. But presuming now that we've had a chance to reflect and meditate on these basic questions, there are frameworks that are handy and complex, but not too complex in their rough outlines to employ. I think the easiest framework, because the most familiar, is sometimes called the utilitarian framework. I don't prefer that because I don't like the emphasis on utile or utility or use. So I prefer to think in terms of a consequentialist framework. And a quick and important question to ask yourself before you make a decision is, you know, what are the apparent consequences of my decision? If I do this, what's likely to happen? What are the consequences of my action? Now, we're always impoverished with respect to evidence about what our actions will yield. We don't know everything our actions will produce. Quite the contrary, we're always dramatically underdetermined in our evidence about what our actions will create. However, we mustn't let perfection be an enemy of the good, right? So lacking perfect understanding of the consequences, we can still make pretty good judgments about the consequences in many cases. And wherever you are, whatever homework you've done, whatever research you've done, whatever conversations you've had, whoever you trust, that's going to inform your answer to the question when you're in a conversation with a dealer and you're deciding to buy the rough from that person. You know, what are the consequences here? And remember that you're answering that question always in light of the question, what do I think is most important? What do I care about most? These are the consequences that are likely if I do this. Are any of those consequences abhorrent to me? Are they unacceptable? Are they so unacceptable that I'm simply not willing to do it? Or if they're not radically unacceptable, what are the costs and how might I mitigate those costs somehow, right? So that's the consequentialist framework. It's a very important framework because karma as a concept modulated to Western thinking is the idea that for every action, there's a reaction, right? And you're all experienced, mature individuals. You know that if you do X, Y, Z, you're going to see A, B, C most likely, right? Now, sometimes maybe you'll be completely in the dark, right? And then you have to ask yourself, are you willing to take a shot in the dark? That's a different ethical question. Another framework, which has a fancy title, deontology, is sometimes useful, but often not. But it's nevertheless always important to ask the question, what are my principles based on what I love and care about most? And if I do this, will I be violating some of those principles? So for example, one of the principles that is common to this kind of rule-based moral framework is the idea that you should never, ever use another living being merely as a means to your ends, indifferent to their own happiness, their own thriving, and their own flourishing. This is sometimes thought to be canonized in the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. However, that rule can be twisted in all kinds of perverse ways. So it's better to think it through the way Kant suggested. I'm about to do something. In doing this, will I be treating somebody merely as a means to my ends and not as an end in themselves? Will they be used by me as a tool for my purposes, indifferent to how my use of them affects them, and in particular affects their thriving, their flourishing, their happiness? This is another framework that was made famous by Immanuel Kant, but is notably informing the natural law tradition in Christian thought, is part of the Dharmic tradition in Buddhist thought, and has its roots in ancient Greek philosophical ideas too. So consequentialism and deontology, or moral laws. Again, both of these depend upon the prior and fundamental question, what do I care about most? A third framework, which has been less popular in the last 100 years, but which was the dominant framework for most of Western history, most of Western philosophical history, is the virtue ethical framework. Here the question is about whatever action we're talking about. So buying some rough, you know. Is buying rough today from this person the best thing I can do, given what I believe is best? The reason this isn't identical with a consequentialist or rule-based ethic is that you are holding up your action against your ideals, which emerge out of what you love or what you value most. And it's a creative act by means of which you create, to the extent this is possible given your constellation of concerns, a unified understanding of what excellent action is for you. So one way of thinking about this is, if I do this, will I betray myself? If I do something like this, will I betray the person I hope to be? Given my commitments, if I do this, will I undermine myself? And of course, to answer that question, we have to have engaged in the Odyssey, the question of, who am I? What do I wish to be? What do I define myself as being? when I think of myself as my best self. So that's another framework. Let me now introduce the last framework, which is a feminist framework, and which is, I think, very broadly represented in African traditions, traditional African traditions. I also see it in indigenous traditions in the Americas. In the ethics of care, the question you have to ask yourself whenever you make any action is, in doing this, am I being careful? And what that means is, am I harming those I care most about first? Am I harming any others for whom I have care? Am I harming any others for whom I ought to have care, although maybe I don't seem to care much about them? And notice that there are circles of care. There are constellations of care. You begin, for the Stoics, with a care for yourself. And I am responsible to care for myself, according to the Stoics. But in caring for myself, what did that mean? It meant that I'm caring for what I think is most important. And what is most important may be something other than my body or my selfish interests, where selfish is defined quite differently from caring for myself. And then we expand to my family, or the people who are my loved ones, my beloveds, my wife, Alix, my mother, Betsy, my brother, Chris, my friend, Steve. And then beyond my family to the people I care about a great deal, but who aren't really my responsibility as a father or a son or a brother. My students, for example, I care enormously about my students, my colleagues, members of my spiritual community. And then extending beyond that to my fellow citizens, my fellow human beings, my fellow animals, etc. Another framework, therefore, that asks you to consider your action in light of an ever-expanding set of commitments you have, an ever-expanding set of cares that you have, ensuring that you care for those you are charged with caring for most, and then next most, and then next most, and then next most, right? Ideally, of course, we would care for everybody. But that seems to be a godly capacity, right? So those are the 4 main frameworks that I would recommend in sketch form are useful.
Thanks, Mark. So I know, we are recording this, so we'll all be able to revisit these ideas over and over again as we need to or wish to. It will be there available for you. Something that's coming up is we did reach out for questions in advance of this session. And so we have coming up next, Duane, who's an educator, a jeweler, a leader in Canada, in the jewelry community in Canada. And I think we'll move to her for her question, but it opens up what many of us are here to do, and that is also to be a guide. So there's this internalization of ethical practice in the, along the frameworks you've given us an opportunity to consider. But then when you take on the responsibility of telling other people you're going to help them on this journey, whether you are in business selling a product or you're coaching kind of in the way that my business operates, or you're an organization kind of like Ethical Metalsmiths, or you're literally an educator in a classroom nourishing ideas for the next generation of leadership, guiding guiding people on this ethical journey becomes a little harder. So Christine, I hope that didn't change kind of where you wanted to come in with your question too much, but this is serious business to kind of take on this responsibility. So I'm looking for you in the video. I'm assuming you're unmuted and ready. Where are you?
Ready and unmuted.
There you are.
Thank
Welcome.
you. So as Christina said, I'm here sort of in my role as a teacher and guide and to help students and those who have questions about starting an ethical practice, where to start. I think I should start by reading the actual concise question, and then I just want to bring a few points out in it. If I may, thank you. So the question is, when there are limits to the industry and our individual capacity, how do we determine what responsible practices to prioritize? Are some more important than others, and why? What I'd like to add at the end of that is, because this is a process, it's nor black or white, good or bad, it's all in the gray areas. At what point in this process is it ethical to claim that we're ethical jewelers? I see a lot of greenwashing and a lot of practice that frankly makes me angry, because the companies are not doing their motivation is not to help others, it's to use others for their profit. So how do we distinguish ourselves from those practices, those people, those companies who practice that way? So to come back to the beginning of the question, limits of the industry, they're very limited in terms of ethical practices and availability of sourced items for us, which sometimes make us have to combine our pieces with some sourced materials, some not as well sourced. Limits of our individual capacity, referring to, for my students, they're learning their practice, they're learning to set up a business, they're learning implementation of all of these things, putting everything together. They have severe financial limits. And then how to prioritize our practice. Is it do we prioritize practices in the workshop or sourcing tools? It could be, where are they made? How are they made? Be sourcing materials, stones and metals. It becomes so vast and overwhelming, on top of learning about all the issues there are associated with the trade, that some of my students, I almost have to become a therapist, because they're ready to quit when they hear about all the problems involved and what they may have to navigate, what they have to choose to navigate. So it's about being able to guide them with responsible practices and how to approach it in a feasible way. What do we prioritize? That would be it.
It's a pleasure to see you, Christine, and thank you. It's a pleasure to hear your voice, and I hope someday I can meet you in person.
It would be my pleasure.
Mine too. Very important questions. A very important question. Let me start with the question of limits. The question of finitude. We are all finite in our capacities. That is a fact about us, apparently. Perhaps there is some omnipotent, but it doesn't seem that each or any of us is omnipotent. So we are limited, and the ethical must take that into account, and has always taken that into account. And so no one is unethical if they have failed to do the impossible. We must work within what is possible for us. And specifically, I must work within what is possible for me. And so each of us has the good fortune to be gifted with various kinds of potential. Those potentials, those powers, offer us opportunities to act, but they're limited, they're finite. We need to know what they are, and we need to know our limits. Some of us are in positions of authority where we're able to make decisions that can have very broad consequences in an industry, say. If you're the President of the United States and you make a decision that has more consequences for the global community than if I make a similar decision about a similar topic from my office in Imperial Valley as a professor of philosophy. Right? The scope of my power is limited. So is the scope of the president's power, right? But we all have different scopes. It's important to know what the scopes are. And then to sink into that, to be comfortable with that, to be okay with the knowledge that given where you are and who you are not in a position to do this or that or the other thing that you might like to do if you had the power, but you are in a position to do something else. And so it's easy to become overwhelmed if we take upon ourselves more than we could possibly do. But if we think through, what's most important for me here, now, today, based on what is most important to me quite generally, what are the available activities I could pursue today, given who I am and what my capacities are? And in making my choices, ensuring that I'm aware of what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and doing the best I can to pursue the good as I understand it. If all of that is in hand, then you are in a position to judge yourself as ethical. If you've considered, what do I care about? What are the consequences of this? Am I acting according to my best self, the principles that I hold about what I care most about? Then you are in a position, given what we mean by ethical in Western thought, to judge yourself ethical. And really, in the end, it always comes back to you and me ensuring that we are doing what we can do. We can always look at someone else and ask, are they being ethical? And then a different set of questions emerges. Since we're not in control of their free consciousness, in order to figure out if they are being ethical, we have to investigate and make judgments based on testimony and evaluation and all of that, right? That's a different question. If we decide that there are players on the field who are being unethical, and it's important enough to us to try to ensure that there are referees on the field who keep people from making fouls according to rules that we can establish, then we have moved to the political. We've moved to the social ethical realm. We moved away from the individual personal ethical responsibilities we have to the social and political activities we might engage in ethically in order to create a more ethical community environment, right? And again, we have to come back to the question, otherwise we will get overwhelmed because there are billions of people in the world. We are unlikely to be able to affect all of them in a way that we would like in order to ensure that the jewelry industry isn't greenwashing, say, right? But given who we know, given where we are, given the time we have, given our commitments to what is most important, what can we do to improve the situation today? And if enough people in this room were doing that, and I assume, in fact, that most of the people in the room here are doing that, then that has a propagating effect. You are transforming the world by doing just this kind of thing. By engaging in this kind of activity, you are creating trust. You are building political power. You are creating a field of agency where being ethical is important, right? And that propagates. The next person who sees that and realizes, oh, I don't have to despair. I don't have to live with this pain any longer. I can feel a measure of confidence that I'm leading a good life in doing what I love to do. Knowing that I'm not able to save the world, but knowing that I can make a difference today. And doing a good act is good enough. Being ethical here and now is good enough. And you know, I hate to use trite, but I will use a trite maxim, right? With power comes responsibility. Be careful what you pray for. Be careful what you wish for, right? If you want to change the world enough to get the power to change the world, recognize that you will be encumbered with the responsibility of making sure that you are changing the world in the right way. And you might prefer to dig your own gold and refine it yourself and all the rest instead of taking on the responsibility of the world. That's not to say, though, that becoming mindful of what you buy, from whom you buy it, and engaging in political activism and being socially active and moving towards a better world isn't available and tolerable. But we don't want to create our own hell in the pursuit of heaven, right? That's a mistake. I hope that gets at some of the questions around limits and the difference between the individual and the industry. Right? The limits of the industry are, in the end, limits of people in the industry willing to make good choices. And the people within the industry are the folks who will need to change the industry, perhaps because of pressure from people outside the industry, or from pressure within the industry, or from pressure on top of the industry, or however you want to characterize. But when you talk about a community and you talk about shaping its activity and moving within its limits, you're always talking about a whole made up of parts that are ultimately conscious agents. Some really interesting questions around plural agency, the agency and freedom of choice that is possessed by corporate entities like species or families or bowling clubs, or, to the point, jewelry industry corporations or jewelry industry writ large. Interesting questions, difficult questions. I hope that's somewhat helpful.
Okay. Yes, I think it is. Oh, Christine, I'm sorry, did you want to respond?
Oh, just to the last little part, at what point in our process of becoming in this gray zone of being an ethical jeweler can we claim we're an ethical jeweler?
Well, I think that we're always in the gray. If you're interested in sort of the deep metaphysical dimensions of this, really the two best philosophers were French, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. They've really explored this. We are always, therefore, at risk of making a mistake in our judgment, because we are always trying to measure the effectiveness of our decision making, which is always fallible. The individual, though, is judged by her intent to use her freedom of choice on the basis of what she has carefully considered as what is most important, in light of various principles and consequences and care relationships and ideals that animate her ethical consciousness, to choose to do the right thing. And if you've done that work to the best of your ability, then you are ethical. And you might make mistakes, and someone might be kind enough to point them out. I get instructed on a daily basis about my mistakes as an administrator and as a philosopher. But those teachers are helping me to realize that I am vulnerable to mistake, that I am fallible. And I take those as opportunities to improve my deliberations for the next time I have to act. And I think that one of the best ways to engage in self-discovery is to engage in dialogue with other people in whom you have trust, with whom you have love relations or care relations, so they can provide you with insight we often lack on ourselves. And that's also a good way to judge whether your judgments about your being ethical are accurate. Someone who loves you and cares about you might say, you know, I think you're being self-serving here, or I think you're deluded in thinking that you're being honest here. You know, they might correct your judgment, because we are not transparent to ourselves. We are very complicated beings, right?
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
I want to pop in just to start our wrap-up process. I want to thank Christine and Jared for posing their questions. And I want to say, I know that some of this conversation is a bit more philosophical maybe than people expected. We all really want to access tools and resources and know exactly what next steps to take. But like Jared said, we have inherited this system, and nobody has a set perfect way to fix it or do better. It's on all of us to do that and to make sure that we are doing that in the best way possible. It is really important to take a step back and have these reflections. The last thing we want is to have positive intentions and then unintended negative consequences. So it's important that even as we start to get answers, we keep kind of reconsidering and reframing. And so Mark has some homework for us. These conversations aren't going to end here. We're going to hopefully continue having sessions like this where we can ask big picture questions, and as we apply them to our lives, we can keep coming back and sharing those experiences. So thank you all again for being here, and we'll let Mark kind of wrap it up and give us some things to think about as we close out the meeting today.
Well, first of all, let me thank you all again, especially Christina and Maggie and the leadership of Ethical Metalsmiths for your leadership in creating this community experience. I admire all of you for your concern to be ethical and to be ethical as jewelers or as members of the jewelry world, the jewelry industry. I admire that. It is a tall mountain to climb to transform the jewelry community and the jewelry industry into an ethical community. And yet it's the right mountain to climb, right? It's the right thing to do. And let me make a couple of references for you with respect to books that you might want to pick up. Christina will provide you with this in the chat or in follow-up, but Harry Frankfurt's book, The Reasons of Love, Christine Korsgaard's book, Self-Constitution, Bell Hooks's book, All About Love, and Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. These are all books that approach the question of being ethical in ways that are relevant to our lives today. These are all relatively recent books. And relevant to the contexts in which we find ourselves today in early 21st century Earth. So let's, at this ending, return to the beginning and let's quiet ourselves and become aware of our awareness and aware of what we're aware of what is, as it is for us right now, and aware of what is possible, what the day holds for us. And feel your capacity to choose. Become aware of that power to choose. And recognize that this is where you need to be whenever you wish to be ethical, mindful and intentional and deliberate about your choice. And let's return to the questions that I think we share today in this space, the particular questions. What do I love most about jewelry? Or what do I love most about the jewelry industry? How do I answer that question today? And what can I choose to do differently now, today, to make jewelry or the jewelry industry better, given what I love most about it, given what I hope it will become, given what I think it would be if it were at its best? What can I do now and today? You have one of the most remarkable, some say miraculous powers, the freedom of choice. Without that, there would be no discussion of ethics. With that, it's really the only thing to talk about. And there I quote Socrates.
Thanks so much, Mark. It's been a great pleasure. And it's important to remember that we are in this together. We are, that holding each other accountable in the way Mark has explained is an expression of love. And the way we hold each other accountable in that space, we can also deliver that in a loving way, in a kind way. So to be open both to giving and receiving of that accountability seems really important. So again, for everyone, those of you that have been on a living room session before, you know that we take the process of, re-listening to the session and identifying some key themes that came out, and we put that together in a summary email, and we also put that on social media. So we'll share that, we'll co-circulate that with Ethical Metalsmiths on this one, which is very exciting. And so you'll receive emails from us on this, but if you want to hear from us further in the future, you actually have to subscribe, because we're not going to send you a bunch of stuff if you don't want to get it. So for both organizations, it's important to do that. And thanks very much for showing up today. This was a record attendance for our events, and it's been a great honor to be in this space with all of you together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, and everyone. Have a great day.
Thank
Peace and
you,
love.
Mark. Thank you, Ethical Metalsmiths. Thank you, Monica, Jared, Christine. Everyone have a wonderful weekend, and we will see you in the next session.
All right. Oh, next session. In October, for your calendars, the Gold Conference, Initiatives in Art and Culture Gold Conference, is going to be virtual this year. And it is October 28th for your calendars. So something to mark there. Okay, officially. Bye.